I arrived at my vacation home needing peace, but my Uncle Marcus was inside. "You're not welcome here," he shouted, his face filled with pure hatred. I just smiled. He had forgotten one thing. I'm the lawyer who wrote the family trust he was so very close to violating. This is where it all fell apart, and trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Make sure you're subscribed. We love hearing from you. What's your favorite way to unwind after a stressful week? Let us know in the comments. The case had been a monster. 6 weeks of depositions, late-night brief writing, and courtroom battles had left me feeling hollowed out, like a husk of myself. I was 48 years old, a successful estate lawyer, but at that moment I was just tired. All I wanted was the scent of pine trees, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore, and the familiar comfort of my parents' old house, now my house. The vacation home had always been my sanctuary, the one place on earth where the complexities of the law and the sharp edges of family drama couldn't touch me. Or so I thought. I pulled my car down the long gravel driveway, the crunch of the stones a familiar, welcome sound. The cabin, a beautiful A-frame my father had built with his own hands, came into view. I breathed a sigh of relief, the tension in my shoulders easing for the first time in months. I grabbed my overnight bag, stepped out into the cool evening air, and walked up the wooden steps. I slid my key into the lock. It didn't turn. Frowning, I jiggled it. Nothing. It felt like the lock was blocked or changed. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I knocked, my knuckles rapping against the heavy oak. "Hello." I heard movement inside. A moment later, the door swung open, but it wasn't a stranger standing there. It was my Uncle Marcus. Marcus was 62, my father's older brother, a man who wore his failed ambitions like an expensive, ill-fitting suit. He'd always had an air of oily charm and a dozen big ideas that never quite panned out. He looked at me, not with surprise, but with a cold, simmering resentment. "Marcus," I said, confused, "what are you doing here? I couldn't get my key to work." "That's because I changed the locks, Abigail," he said, his voice level. He actually puffed his chest out slightly, blocking the doorway. "You changed? What? Why would you do that? This is my house." Behind him, I saw movement in the living room. My younger sister, Lauren, and her husband, Albert, were sitting on the sofa. My sofa. They both looked up, their expressions a sickening mix of guilt and defiance. Lauren, a freelance designer whose college education I had helped finance, quickly looked down at her lap. Albert, a high school history teacher who often complained about being underpaid, just crossed his arms. "That's where you're wrong," Marcus said, his voice rising. "This is a family home, and we've decided, the real family, that we're tired of you hoarding it." The exhaustion from my case evaporated, replaced by a sharp, cold shock. "Hoarding it? Marcus, I'm the trustee. Dad left it to me in the will. You know this." "A piece of paper?" he spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "A piece of paper you, with your slick lawyer tricks, probably wrote yourself to cut us all out. You always thought you were better than us." "That's not." He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing with a pure, unfiltered hatred that stunned me. "You're not welcome here, Abigail. Get off this property." He actually shouted it. The words echoed in the quiet evening air, silencing the birds, silencing everything. "You're not welcome here." My sister and her husband just sat there, saying nothing, their silence a ringing endorsement of his words. I looked at their faces, Marcus, triumphant and righteous, Lauren, ashamed but complicit, Albert, stubbornly hostile. I felt the ground drop out from beneath me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a coup. This was a betrayal I hadn't seen coming. My own family, in my own sanctuary, telling me to leave. I took an involuntary step back, my hand still on the doorknob. My first instinct was to fight, to argue, to pull out my phone and call the police. But I was an attorney. I knew that a messy, public fight was the worst way to handle this, especially when I realized what was really going on. So I did the one thing they didn't expect. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile I saved for opposing counsel when they had just torpedoed their own case. It was a smile that was all teeth. Okay, I said softly. Marcus's smug expression faltered, confused by my lack of hysteria. Okay, you're leaving. For now, I said, letting my hand fall from the door. I looked past him at Lauren. She finally met my gaze and I held it, letting her see the profound disappointment in my eyes. Then I looked back at Marcus. You're right, Marcus. This is a family home, I said, my voice calm and clear. And as the family's lawyer, I'm just reminding you that you should always read the fine print. The betrayal was sharper than any legal battle I'd ever fought, but the coming victory would be infinitely sweeter. I turned and walked back to my car, my movements deliberate. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of confusion and smug victory. They thought they had won. They thought that because I didn't scream or cry or call the sheriff, I was weak. They had mistaken my controlled fury for surrender. It was a mistake they would come to regret. As I pulled the car onto the main road, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a deep, seismic tremor of hurt. Lauren. It was Lauren's silence that cut the deepest. I had practically raised her after our mother got sick. I'd paid for her art degree, co-signed the loan for her first apartment, and advised her and Albert on their mortgage. I had been her rock. And in the space of an afternoon, she had chosen Marcus over me. I drove for 10 minutes before I had to pull over into a scenic overlook, the lake sprawling out below me in the twilight. I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tears came then, hot and angry. Tears for my parents, who would have been horrified. Tears for my sister, who had allowed herself to be poisoned against me. And tears for myself, for the loss of the one place I truly felt safe. This wasn't just about a house. It was about respect. It was about loyalty. And it was about the sickening realization that, to a certain kind of person, none of that mattered as much as the perceived value of a piece of real estate. I checked into a nearby hotel, a clean, sterile place that was the exact opposite of the warm, wooden cabin. I sat on the edge of the stiff bedspread and took a deep breath, the lawyer part of my brain finally kicking into high gear, pushing the hurt into a locked box for later. This was a case now. Abigail v. the usurpers. I took out my phone and called Lauren. It went straight to voicemail. Lauren, it's Abigail. We need to talk. Call me. I tried Albert, straight to voicemail. Albert, this is a serious situation. You and Lauren are being party to something illegal. You need to call me immediately. Of course, they didn't. They were hiding behind Marcus, letting him be the vanguard. I sat back, my mind racing. Marcus was the key. He was arrogant, greedy, and not nearly as smart as he believed. Lauren and Albert were just weak. They were followers, easily swayed by the promise of easy money or the fear of missing out. Marcus must have spun them a story. My mind sifted through the possibilities. He'd probably told them I was planning to sell the house, a common fear in families. He'd probably painted me as the rich, childless, work-obsessed older sister who didn't deserve the house as much as they, a struggling couple, did. He positioned himself as their champion, the one brave enough to stand up to me. I pulled my laptop from my bag and connected to the hotel's Wi-Fi. My entire professional life was built on understanding the precise, unyielding language of legal documents. And the document that governed that lake house was one of my finest pieces of work. My parents, bless them, had been generous but also deeply pragmatic. They had seen the way Marcus looked at their possessions, the way he'd borrowed money from them over the years with no intention of paying it back. They had seen Lauren's and Albert's chronic financial mismanagement. So, when we sat down to do their estate plan, my father had a very specific request. I want the house to stay in the family, Abby, he'd said, but I don't want it to tear the family apart. I don't want them fighting over it, or some fool to sell it to pay a gambling debt. So I hadn't left the house to myself, or to Lauren outright. That would have been simple, but it would have been vulnerable. Instead, I had created the Harris Family Irrevocable Trust. I opened the file on my secure server and read the familiar paragraphs. I, Abigail Harris, was the sole trustee. The house was the primary asset of the trust. As trustee, I had the sole power to manage the property. Lauren, and any children she might have, were listed as beneficiaries, meaning they could use the property with the trustees' permission. But here was the beautiful part. I scrolled down to Article IV, Section 3. The no contest clause was standard, but Section 4 was the one I was looking for, the asset protection clause. I had written it myself. It explicitly stated that no beneficiary could establish primary residence, change the locks, or encumber the property in any way, like trying to get a loan against it, without the express written consent of the trustee. Any beneficiary who did so would be in material breach of the trust. I smiled again, that same cold, sharp smile from the porch. They were loud, arrogant, and so very, very wrong. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I was the one who wrote the will, and I had written it for this exact rainy day. To understand Marcus, you have to understand my family's dynamic. My father was the responsible one, a civil engineer who built a stable life through hard work and careful planning. Marcus was his opposite, a man who believed stability was for suckers and that a big windfall was always just around the corner. He drifted from one consulting gig to another, sold dubious timeshares in the 90s, and most recently had rebranded himself as a family investor, which seemed to mean he just gave terrible financial advice to his in-laws. He'd always been a drain on my parents. I remembered countless hushed arguments, my mother closing the checkbook with a snap, my father saying, "Marcus, this is the last time." It was never the last time. He had a way of making you feel like you were the failure for not believing in his vision. When my parents passed, the dynamic shifted. I became the de facto head of the family, the one with the stable career and the legal knowledge. Marcus's resentment, once aimed at his successful brother, now found a new target, me. He saw my success not as the result of 80-hour work weeks and crippling student loans, but as a kind of cosmic unfairness. Lauren and Albert, on the other hand, were a different story. Lauren is my half-sister, 10 years younger, and I've always felt fiercely protective of her. But as she got older, her free-spirit, artistic nature, which I'd always admired, curdled into a kind of willful helplessness. She and Albert were perpetually in a mild financial crisis. They overspent on their wedding, bought a house they couldn't quite afford, and were always one bad month away from asking for help. I'd always given it. I'd paid for their last 3 vacations, telling myself it was just being a good sister. Now, I saw it differently. I hadn't been helping, I had been enabling. I had taught them that consequences were optional, that Abigail would always be there to clean up the mess. My sacrifices meant nothing because they had come to see them as an entitlement. And Marcus, a predator-smelling weakness, had exploited that perfectly. He hadn't just promised them a house, he'd given them a villain. Me, the gatekeeper. I spent the next morning at a local coffee shop, nursing a latte and making a plan. My first call was not to the police. It was to a man named Frank. Frank is a private investigator, a former financial crimes detective with a bloodhound's nose for fraud. "Hey Frank, it's Abigail Harris." "Abby, long time. What's the emergency?" "You only call me when someone's trying to hide money," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Something like that. I need you to run a full financial background on my uncle, Marcus Harris. I want everything. Credit report, outstanding liens, recent loan applications, any and all shell corporations. I want to know if he's bought so much as a pack of gum on credit in the last 6 months." "Family messy," Frank grunted. "You got it. Give me 48 hours. "Thanks, Frank, I owe you." "Yeah, you do. This one's on the family rate, which means it'll cost you double." He hung up. My next calls were simpler. I called the utility companies for the lake house. The electric, the water, the internet. "Hi," I said to the automated system, then to the human representative. "I'm calling about account number 882J45. I need to report a fraudulent change of service." One by one, I re-established my authority. I was the one on the deed, the one whose name was on the trust. I explained that I was the property owner and that any attempt to change the billing information was unauthorized. And, I added, could you please email me a record of any service calls or change requests made in the last 30 days? By noon, I had the first breadcrumbs. The locks had been changed 3 weeks ago. The internet and cable had been upgraded to a premium package, and the bill had been put in Albert's name. Albert, not even Marcus. He was already insulating himself, using my sister and her husband as his shield. This was so much darker than I thought. This wasn't a spontaneous family decision. This had been planned. They had waited. They must have known I was tied up with my case, that I'd be out of touch and exhausted. They'd waited for me to be at my most vulnerable. A new kind of anger, cold and precise, settled over me. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. This was conspiracy to commit fraud. Marcus wasn't just trying to get a vacation spot, he was trying to steal a 6-figure asset. He was using my sister as an accomplice. And I, as the trustee, had a fiduciary duty to protect the trust. A legal obligation. My smile returned. They hadn't just betrayed me as a sister, they had crossed me as a lawyer. The hotel room felt like a command center. I had my laptop open, a legal pad filled with notes, and a steady supply of bad coffee. I was no longer a victim, I was a strategist. My grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but I compartmentalized it. Grief could wait, justice couldn't. Frank called back in 36 hours, not 48. You hit the jackpot, Abby, or maybe your uncle hit the septic tank. Talk to me, Frank. Marcus Harris is a financial dumpster fire. He's got 3 maxed-out credit cards, all in collections. He's got a $40,000 personal loan from a high-interest lender, and he's missed the last 2 payments. The family investor business? It's a shell LLC with a P.O. box and $112 in its bank account. But here's the kicker. He's being sued. 2 of his former partners, from a failed real estate deal in Arizona, are taking him to court for $500,000, claiming fraud. I closed my eyes, so he's desperate. He's not desperate, Abby. He's drowning, Frank said. And here's the cherry on top. I ran a credit inquiry search. 3 weeks ago, he applied for a home equity line of credit for $150,000. He used the lake house as collateral. My blood ran cold. The bank would never approve that. My name is on the deed. They didn't. It was denied instantly. But he tried. He actually filed the paperwork, claiming he was the managing partner of the property. The man's got guts, I'll give him that, or he's just plain stupid. Both, I said, writing it all down. Frank, you're a genius. Send me the full report, all of it. The lawsuit, the loan application, everything. It's already in your inbox, he said. Good luck, counselor, nail him. I hung up and immediately opened my email. It was all there, a detailed and catastrophic portrait of a man at the end of his rope. This wasn't about family rights. This was a cash grab. He saw the lake house as his personal piggy bank, his last-ditch effort to save himself from total financial ruin. He had manipulated Lauren and Albert, preying on their own financial insecurities and painting me as the dragon hoarding gold. I now had the why. I already had the how from the trust document. I had everything I needed to destroy him in a court of law. But a court of law would be messy. It would be public. It would be expensive. And it would permanently, irrevocably shatter my relationship with Lauren, dragging her and Albert through a legal battle they couldn't afford and wouldn't understand. I didn't want to just win. I wanted to solve this. I wanted my sister back. And to do that, I had to sever Marcus's influence for good. I had to make her see who she had allied herself with. I needed to stage the first confrontation, not with Marcus, with Lauren. I spent the rest of the day preparing a single, curated file. I didn't include the whole pie report, it was too overwhelming. I selected just 2 documents, the denied HELOC, home equity line of credit, application, and the cover sheet for the fraud lawsuit. That evening, I drove back to the lake house. I parked on the road, not in the driveway. I walked to the front porch and knocked. It was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Albert opened the door, not Marcus. He looked nervous, his high school teacher demeanor completely gone. "Abigail, Marcus isn't here." "I know," I said calmly. "I'm not here to see Marcus. I'm here to see my sister." He hesitated. She's not feeling well." "Let me in, Albert," I said. It wasn't a request. My voice had the same steel it did in the courtroom. "You can either let me talk to my sister right now, or you can talk to a sheriff's deputy in about 10 minutes. Your choice." He deflated, his weak-willed bluster vanishing. He stepped aside. The house smelled like stale coffee and fear. Lauren was on the sofa, curled under a blanket, the same one our mother had knitted years ago. She looked pale. "Lauren," I said, my voice softer now. She flinched. "Abby, you shouldn't be here. Marcus will be furious." "I don't care about Marcus," I said, walking closer. "I care about you. What is going on? Why are you doing this?" "He told us," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He told us you were going to sell it, that you were in talks with a developer to build condos. He said you thought the house was a burden and you were just going to take the money and cut us out." I stared at her. "And you believed him? You believed Marcus over me, after everything?" "He had proof," Albert chimed in, trying to find his footing. "He showed us an email." "An email?" I almost laughed. "Albert, I could fake an email in 5 minutes. You're a history teacher. You're supposed to be smart. Did you ask to see the developer's offer? Did you do any research?" "Marcus's family," Albert said, falling back on the tired excuse. "So am I snapped. "And I am the only one in this room who is telling the truth." Lauren started to cry, fat, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. He said we deserved a piece of it, that we're struggling, and you have so much. Abby, it's not fair." There it was, the raw, ugly heart of it, envy. "Fair," I repeated. "Okay, let's talk about what's fair." I took the file from my briefcase and dropped it on the coffee table in front of them. "You think Marcus is your champion, your savior? You think he's standing up for you?" Lauren looked at the file, confused. "That," I said, pointing to the first page, "is a loan application. Your Uncle Marcus tried to borrow $150,000 against this house, our house. He listed himself as the owner. The bank denied it because he's not the owner. I am. He wasn't trying to save the house for you, Lauren. He was trying to steal it. He was going to let the bank foreclose on it and leave all of us with nothing." Lauren's sobs hitched. Albert's face went white. He picked up the paper, his hands trembling. "And that," I said, tapping the second document, "is a lawsuit. He's being sued for $500,000 for fraud. He is a desperate, bankrupt con artist. And he is using you. He's using your envy and your financial problems to turn you against me so he can rob you blind." Lauren let out a small, wounded sound. No, he wouldn't." "He is," I said, my voice hard. "He put the new utility bills in your name, Albert. Not his. Why do you think that is? So when the fraud is exposed, you're the one who looks complicit. You're his shield." The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. The fantasy Marcus had built for them, a fantasy of righteous anger and justified payback, crumbled in an instant, revealing the ugly reality underneath. Just then, we heard a car pull into the driveway. Headlights swept across the living room window. "He's back," Albert whispered, dropping the papers as if they were on fire. "Good," I said, turning to face the door. "Now we can have a real family meeting." Marcus burst through the door, his face instantly twisting into a mask of rage when he saw me. "I told you to leave. I'm calling the police." "No, you're not," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "You're going to stand right there, and you're going to explain to your nephew why you put a fraudulent utility application in his name. And then, you're going to explain to your niece why you tried to take out a loan on her inheritance. Go on, Marcus, explain." Marcus looked from my face to the papers on the table, and his color drained. The bluster, the arrogance, the hatred, it all vanished, replaced by the panicked, cornered look of an animal caught in a trap. He didn't speak, he just stared at me. And I knew in that moment that the spell was broken. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Lauren and Albert looked at Marcus, their faces a canvas of dawning horror and confusion. They were waiting for him to deny it, to laugh it off, to provide another one of his smooth, reasonable-sounding explanations. "Marcus," Lauren whispered, is that true?" Marcus, for the first time in his life, was speechless. He saw the HELOC application on the table. He saw the lawsuit. He knew instantly that I had him, but a cornered rat doesn't surrender, it gets vicious. He lashed out, not at me but at them. "You believe her, after everything I'm trying to do for you? She's a liar, she faked those. She's a lawyer, that's what she does, she twists things." It was a poor performance. His voice was too high, his eyes too shifty. "Faked them," I said, picking up the bank denial. "This has the bank's official letterhead, Marcus, and the loan officer's name. We can call him right now, and the lawsuit is a public record. You can't fake a public record." Albert, who had been pale, started to turn red. You put my name on the utility bill," he said, his voice quiet. I was consolidating things, to make it easier for the family," Marcus stammered, backing away toward the kitchen. "You were making him the legal point of contact for a property you're illegally occupying, Marcus," I shot back. "That's not helping, that's making him an accessory." Lauren stood up, her legs shaking. "Uncle Marcus, just tell me you didn't try to sell the house." "Of course not, I was looking into its value, for our future, for all of us." It was pathetic. The lies were so transparent, so desperate, that they fell apart as soon as they left his mouth. Lauren, who had wanted so badly to believe in his fantasy, finally saw the cheap magician behind the curtain. "Get out," she whispered. "What?" Marcus blinked. "Get out," she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat. She grabbed a throw pillow from the sofa and hurled it at him. "Get out of our house. Get out." Marcus, shocked by her sudden turn, scrambled backward, grabbed his keys from the counter, and bolted out the front door. We heard his car start, tires spinning on the gravel as he sped away. And then silence again. Lauren collapsed onto the sofa, her sobs echoing in the room. Albert just stood there looking. At the open door, his face ashen. I sat down, my anger giving way to a profound sadness. I had won the battle, but the war for my family felt far from over. I spent the next 2 hours just sitting with them. I explained the trust, calmly, paragraph by paragraph. I explained why I had set it up this way, to protect the house for them, not from them. To prevent exactly this, a scenario where a predator like Marcus could swoop in and leverage family assets for his own gain. They were ashamed. Deeply, painfully ashamed. Albert confessed that Marcus had been advising them on their own finances, that they'd given him $10,000 to invest 6 months ago, money they'd pulled from their small retirement fund. They hadn't seen a dime of it since. The trap had been bigger than I even knew. Marcus wasn't just after the house. He was systematically draining my sister and her husband of every cent they had. My resolve hardened. This was no longer just about the house. This was about saving my sister from ruin. I knew Marcus wouldn't just disappear. He was too desperate. He'd try something else. So I went on the offensive. The next morning, I hired a local locksmith to change the locks again, this time to a high-security system. I gave a key to Lauren and Albert, but I also had a long talk with them. "He's going to contact you," I said, as they sat at the kitchen table, looking like scolded children. "He's going to apologize or threaten you or try to manipulate you again. You cannot speak to him, not a text, not a call. Am I clear? Anything he sends you, you forward it to me immediately." They both nodded, their eyes wide. I wasn't done. I took the full PI report and the trust documents to the local sheriff's department. I filed a formal complaint against Marcus for trespassing, attempted fraud, and uttering threats. He'd sent me a string of furious, barely coherent texts. I also filed for an immediate, temporary restraining order. My professional network, the one Marcus so resented, kicked into high gear. I had a colleague in the DA's office review the file. I spoke to the bank's fraud department. I was building a case so solid, so ironclad, that Marcus would have no choice but to disappear. But I still needed the final checkmate. I needed to ensure that Lauren and Albert were truly free of his influence. The $10,000 they'd invested was the key. Frank, my pie, was a godsend. He tracked the $10,000. It wasn't invested. It had gone from their bank account directly into Marcus's, and from there, it had been paid to a high-end car leasing company and a casino in Atlantic City. I now had irrefutable proof of his deception. I had the bank fraud, the trespassing, and now the theft from his own niece. I consolidated everything into a single, devastating file. I made 3 copies, one for me, one for my lawyer, and one for the family meeting I was about to call. Marcus thought he could humiliate me. He had no idea what it felt in store. The showdown came 2 weeks later. It wasn't at the lake house. That, I had decided, was no longer a place for conflict. It was a place for healing. Instead, I arranged the meeting at my parents' old law firm, my firm now, in the city. I chose the main conference room, a place of imposing mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows, a room designed to project power and unassailable authority. I had invited everyone. Lauren and Albert were there, sitting nervously at the far end of the table. I had also invited my father's sister, Aunt Clara, a formidable woman who was the family's unofficial matriarch. And of course, I had invited Marcus. He showed up, surprisingly. He must have believed, with his delusional narcissism, that this was his chance to tell his side, to paint me as the villain in front of the rest of the family. He walked in wearing his best suit, attempting to project an air of wounded dignity. "Abigail," he said, nodding curtly as if I were the one on trial. "Clara, glad you could make it. There are some serious fabrications we need to clear up." "There are," I said, my voice dangerously pleasant. I remained standing at the head of the table. "Please, Marcus, sit down." He sat opposite Lauren and Albert, who refused to look at him. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice echoing slightly in the large room. "I know there has been a lot of confusion regarding the lake house and other family matters. I called this meeting to provide absolute, final clarity." Marcus leaned forward, opening his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "You'll have your turn, Marcus. Mine first." I looked at Aunt Clara. "Aunt Clara, you know that Dad appointed me as trustee of the family trust. Marcus has been spreading a rumor that I intend to sell the house." "A valid concern, Abigail," Clara said, her eyes sharp. "That house means a lot to this family." "It does," I agreed. "Which is why my father and I legally structured the trust to make it impossible to sell. Without the unanimous consent of all beneficiaries and proof that the trust can no longer afford the upkeep. It is, perhaps, one of the most protected properties in the state. The rumor was a lie manufactured for one purpose, to create panic." I then looked at Marcus. "Marcus, you told Lauren and Albert that I was the one cutting them out. But in reality, you were the one who tried to take out a $150,000 loan against the property, a property you do not own. This is called attempted bank fraud." I slid the first folder down the polished table. It landed in front of Marcus. "That's a copy of the application you filed, and the bank's denial, and the report I've already filed with their fraud department." Marcus's face went pale. Now, that was a misunderstanding. "Was it also a misunderstanding when you changed the locks on my home?" I continued, my voice rising. "Was it a misunderstanding when you put the utility bills in Albert's name, making him legally complicit in your illegal occupation?" I slid a second folder. "That's a copy of the utility bill, Albert, and a copy of the new high-security lock invoice, which I paid for." I turned my full attention to Marcus, who was starting to look physically ill. "But this is the part that I find most offensive. For the last 6 months, you have been advising Lauren and Albert on their finances. You convince them to give you $10,000 of their retirement money to invest. Lauren let out a small sob. Albert stared at the table. I had that investment traced, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. Here is the final file, Marcus. I slid the third, thickest folder across the table. This file contains the bank statements showing the $10,000 leaving Lauren's account and entering yours. It also contains the subsequent receipts. $4,000 as a down payment on a luxury car lease, and $6,000 withdrawn over 2 weekends at the Tropicana Casino in Atlantic City. Aunt Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You didn't invest their money, I said, the room dead silent. You stole it. You stole my sister's money to pay for your car and your gambling habit. You preyed on your own family, turned them against me, and tried to steal our parents' home, all to cover your own pathetic debts. Marcus was white as a sheet. He looked at Lauren and Albert, then at Clara. There was no escape, no lie, no smooth explanation. He was, in a word, finished. I walked to the end of the table and stood directly behind Lauren and Albert. So no, Marcus, I said. I am not selling the house, and you are not part of this family's financial future. In fact, you're not part of this family at all anymore. Lauren, who had been trembling, stood up. She looked at Marcus, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it was almost black. All those years, she whispered. All those years I thought Abby was the cold one, but it was you. It was always you. Albert stood up beside his wife. He looked at Marcus with pure, unadulterated contempt. You will give us our money back, or I swear. You won't have to swear, I interrupted, placing a hand on his shoulder. Because I've already filed the criminal complaint. That was the final blow. Marcus recoiled as if I'd struck him. You what? You committed theft. You committed fraud. I'm an officer of the court, Marcus. I have a duty. An officer is waiting outside this room to serve you with these papers, as well as a permanent restraining order. You will never contact me, my sister, or her husband again. You will not come within 500 feet of the lake house or any of our homes. Is that clear? Marcus stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He was completely and totally destroyed. He looked at Aunt Clara, his last hope. She just shook her head, her expression one of utter disgust. You've shamed this family, Marcus. Get out of my sight. He stood, his chair scraping loudly, and for the first time he looked like what he was, a small, pathetic, broken old man. He walked to the door, opened it, and was met by the officer I'd hired. He was served the papers on the spot, in the hallway of the firm, a final, public humiliation. He was gone. The downfall of Marcus was swift and definitive. Faced with a criminal complaint for theft and multiple civil complaints for fraud, not just from us, but from the other partners he'd swindled, he was ruined. He ended up taking a plea deal to avoid jail time, but it required him to liquidate every asset he had to pay restitution. He lost his car, his rented condo, and every last shred of his reputation. He moved out of state, and we never heard from him again. Aunt Clara made sure the rest of the family knew exactly what he had done, and his name was never spoken with anything but contempt again. But the legal victory was only half the battle. The other half was waiting for me in that conference room. After Marcus left, Lauren and Albert just sat there, utterly broken. The weight of their complicity, their greed, and their profound stupidity settled on them. Abby, Lauren finally whispered, her face blotchy from crying. I don't know what to say. Sorry it's not enough. No, it's not, I said quietly. I wasn't going to make this easy for them, but it's a start. Albert looked at me, his eyes filled with a shame I had never seen in him. We were fools. He preyed on our jealousy, Abigail, of you, your success. He made us feel like victims, and we wanted to believe him. I know, I said, and I did. I saw the rot that envy had started and how Marcus had so skillfully fed it. You have to work on that, both of you. This isn't my problem to fix. It's yours. The reconciliation was not a single, tearful movie moment. It was slow. It was awkward. It took months. It involved them starting financial counseling to deal with their out-of-control spending. It involved them writing me a long, painful letter detailing exactly why they had done what they did and what they understood now. It involved them paying me back $200 at a time for the legal fees and the cost of the new locks. I didn't need the money, but I needed them to understand the consequences. The first time I went back to the lake house, it was 6 months later. It was autumn and the leaves were turning. I walked in and the house was clean. The air smelled like lemon polish and pine. Lauren and Albert were there. They had driven up the day before to air the place out, stock the fridge, and rake the leaves. It was awkward. We made small talk. But then, as we were standing on the deck, looking out at the water, Lauren turned to me. "It's beautiful," she said. I really looked at the trust document you wrote, the one you left for us to read. Dad really was smart, wasn't he? He knew." "Yes," I said, "he knew." "He wanted to protect it for us," she said, finally understanding. "Not from us." "Exactly." She was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you, Abby, for protecting us, even when we were the enemy." That was the moment. That was the real victory. I put my arm around her shoulder and we just stood there, watching the sunset. My professional network had ensured justice was served on Marcus. But my own willingness to be the bad guy for a little while, to use my strength not just to punish, but to teach, is what saved my family. That night, we had dinner together. We laughed. It was strained at first, but it got easier. We were healing. The house was no longer a prize to be won or a fortress to be defended. It was just a house again, our sanctuary. And I finally, after everything, felt at peace.